The night settled over Bantukwu with the kind of heaviness that made even the oldest trees stop rustling, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Bantukwu had always been a place of legends, a city built on red clay and stories older than memory, where the air carried the scent of wood smoke and distant drums. People walked its winding streets with a calm rhythm by day, but at night that calm changed into something else, something watchful, almost suspicious. The palace sat at the highest point of the old city, a giant carved into the rock itself, glowing softly under the torches that lined its gates. Inside, King Mazoba paced more than he slept these days. With every passing moon, he felt the invisible threads of loyalty around him growing thinner, stretched by whispers he couldn't catch. Ministers who once stood close now stood cautious. Servants who bowed low carried eyes that avoided his. Granary reports conflicted with the counts he personally ordered. Gold from the treasury vanished in numbers too small to spark alarm, but too consistent to ignore. And yet, despite the signs, there was no culprit, no face to blame, no voice brave enough to name the truth. Tonight, as he stood alone near the great carved pillars, he felt the strange sensation he had become too familiar with, a pull in the stomach that told him something was coming, something he couldn't predict but could no longer avoid. And that was when the knock echoed across the palace walls. Slow, deliberate, far too calm for a regular traveler. The guards stiffened, hands on the hilts of their spears, exchanging glances that carried more fear than duty. When they opened the giant wooden gate, the torches flickered, almost recoiling, as if the wind itself backed away from the stranger who stood before them. The man introduced himself only as Lumo. His clothes were simple, dusty from long roads, stitched in a style not common in Bantukwu, but not foreign enough to raise suspicions. Yet there was something about him, something the guards felt before they realized it. His presence didn't announce itself with loudness or threat. It was quieter and somehow heavier, like he brought the weight of an unseen world with him. His eyes were calm, too calm, holding a stillness that didn't belong to anyone who had wandered through jungles and villages alone. When he spoke, his voice held a softness that should have been warm, but instead it pressed against the air like a gentle storm waiting to break. He asked only for one thing: shelter for the night. No food, no favor, no guard, no payment, just a corner to rest until dawn. The guards didn't know what to do with that. Travelers who arrived at night were usually desperate, frightened or injured, but this man looked like he had walked through the darkness of the whole world without letting it touch him. They took him to the king with the caution one reserves for sacred objects or venomous snakes, the kind you cannot read until it's too late. When King Mazoba saw Lumo, he felt a strange wave move through him. The man looked harmless, but there was a truth in his gaze that made the king's heart shift inside his chest. The advisors exchanged sharp looks, leaning closer to whisper arguments against letting a stranger cross the palace threshold, especially on a night heavy with political tension. But the king raised his hand before they could plant fear into the moment. "A traveler seeking shelter cannot be refused in Bantukwu," he said quietly, repeating the ancient code of their forefathers. "Even if the night is uneasy." He motioned for Lumo to enter, and the moment the stranger stepped past the threshold, the flames along the hall trembled. Not violently, not dramatically, but in a whisper, as though reacting to something the human eye couldn't see. The palace changed as soon as Lumo entered it. The air felt tighter, more alert, like every stone had opened an eye. Servants walking down the hall slowed, suddenly unsure why their steps felt louder. The guards, seasoned men who feared nothing except spirits of the old forest, found themselves gripping their spears a little too hard, almost embarrassed by the instinct that crept up their spines. Even the musicians in the far courtyard, who usually played gentle rhythms to lull the palace into calm, made small mistakes in their melodies, glancing at each other as the harmony slipped between their fingers. King Mazoba walked beside Lumo with steady steps, but inside his mind, questions collided like birds against a closed window. He tried studying the stranger discreetly, but Lumo moved with an ease that made him look like he had walked these halls before, even though the king was certain he had never seen this face in his life. The palace walls seemed to breathe around him, and every shadow stretched a little longer as if leaning in to listen. Bakery, the king's most trusted servant, stood waiting near the dining hall with a tray of herbal tea, his posture perfect, his expression calm, the picture of loyalty. Yet when Lumo's gaze slid over him, just for a second, Bakery's fingers twitched. A tiny tremor, invisible to most, but not to a king who had spent years learning to read the smallest gestures from those around him. Something inside Mazoba stirred. Distrust? Curiosity? Maybe both. But he brushed it aside. Suspicion without proof was poison, and he already had enough poison growing in the cracks of his leadership. Lumo was given a simple seat at the long wooden table, not too close to the king, not too far as courtesy demanded. The night was settling, yet the air felt like a drum stretched tight, as if the smallest strike could thunder through the hall. And as Lumo sat there silent and calm, the king felt it. The shift, the awakening, the strange peeling of something unseen. It was subtle, something he almost would have missed if he hadn't been paying attention. But he was paying attention. Lumo didn't look at anyone directly, yet everyone felt watched. The ministers who sat toward the far end of the table suddenly found their practiced smiles faltering. Their well-polished lies tasted different on their tongues. The king tried starting a conversation, out of politeness, perhaps even curiosity. But Lumo answered with short truths wrapped in long silences, the kind of responses that made a man question what he had truly asked. "What brings you to Bantukwu this late?" the king asked. Lumo's eyes lifted, steady and unreadable. "The night brought me," he replied. "And the night brings those who are meant to arrive." The king wasn't sure if it was wisdom or warning. He felt the faintest chill crawl across his shoulders, the kind that didn't come from cold air. As the torches flickered again, he noticed something he couldn't quite explain. The shadows on the walls didn't move with the flames, they moved with Lumo. And for the first time in a long while, King Mazoba felt the truth standing very, very close, close enough to breathe. He didn't know that this quiet stranger carried the power to unmask the palace from its darkest lies. He didn't know that before dawn, everything he trusted would crumble. But he did know one thing. The night had changed, and nothing in Bantukwu was going to sleep peacefully again. The king remained seated long after Lumo's quiet observation faded into the echoing stillness of the hall. It was as if the stranger's presence had left behind an aftertaste. Something sharp, something unsettling, something the king could not shake off no matter how deeply he tried to breathe. His fingers hovered near the cup before him, the warm ceramic suddenly feeling like a dangerous object. He had tasted bitterness on his tongue a moment earlier, a flavor that should not have been there. He tried to convince himself that perhaps the herbs had simply been steeped too long, but the faint metallic sting, the strange prickling in his throat, and the lingering memory of Lumo's watchful eyes tore apart any comfortable excuse. The torches lining the hall flickered violently as the wind slipped through cracks in the walls, and for a heartbeat the king felt as though he were sitting at the center of a room that no longer belonged to him. Lumo had walked away in silence, yet the weight of his unspoken warning pressed on the king's chest with the force of an entire hidden world demanding to be seen. Dinner continued, but not in the meaning of the word. Ministers spoke in overly sweet tones, their smiles stretched a little too wide. Servants moved with mechanical precision, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. Bakery, the trusted servant who had served the king for years, approached with another pot of warm herbal tea, offering it with that familiar humble bow he always gave. And yet the king's eyes lingered on his hands, the way they tightened around the handle, the faint twitch in the left thumb, the slight hesitation before pouring. It was small, so small that no one else would notice, yet something inside the king felt its significance immediately. Lumo stood on the far edge of the hall, leaning against a carved wooden column, his face unreadable. His gaze settled on Bakery for only a second, just a second, no more, but in that second the king saw something like a shadow pass between them. Not an actual shadow, but a truth so heavy and so quietly revealed that it made the king's skin crawl. The noise in the hall dissolved into a muted hum. The world narrowed until there was only Bakery, and the cup, and Lumo's unblinking eyes. The king lifted the cup slowly, deliberately, watching Bakery the entire time. The servant's throat bobbed. His smile tried to hold its shape but faltered just slightly at the edges. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, although the night was cool and the hall well ventilated. The king brought the cup closer, paused, then placed it back without drinking. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. A few ministers exchanged confused glances. Others pretended not to notice. But Lumo noticed. Lumo noticed everything. He stepped forward, almost soundless, until he stood near the king's seat. He did not touch the king, did not speak, did not even breathe loudly. He simply existed there, and his presence was enough to fracture the delicate mask the knight had worn until now. Suddenly the torch's flames stretched taller, as if drawn toward an invisible force. Shadows thickened behind the ministers, blooming like dark flowers. And then the king's vision wavered, not blurred, not darkened, wavered, like the surface of a disturbed pond revealing reflections beneath the water. He saw, for a fraction of a second, BIMBO standing over a bowl of herbs, sprinkling something into it, glancing over his shoulder to check if anyone saw, sealing the lid and whispering words the king could not hear. The vision shattered just as fast as it had come, leaving the king breathless. BIMBO took a step back. "Your Majesty, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice cracking in the middle. The king's heart hammered so loudly he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct urged him to stand, to shout, to demand answers. But the truth had wounded him so deeply that he could not react like a king. He could only react like a betrayed man. His voice came out low, slow, trembling from disbelief rather than rage. "BIMBO, bring me the herb jar you used tonight." The request hit the room like a thrown spear. BIMBO's eyes widened, just for an instant, but in that instant the entire palace saw it. The flicker of fear, the glimpse of guilt, the unmistakable crack in his facade. Ministers shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their sleeves. Servants froze mid-step. Even the guards straightened, sensing the sudden danger coiling in the air. BIMBO tried to smile again, but this time the smile died before it even reached his lips. "Of course, Your Majesty. I will bring it at once," he stammered. But when he turned to leave, Lumo stepped slightly to the left, not blocking him outright, but making it impossible for the servant to pass without brushing against him. BIMBO hesitated, and the fear in his eyes grew thick and unmistakable. The king saw everything, and he finally understood Lumo's silent message. Not everyone who stands beside you stands with you. The hall, once filled with rehearsed politeness and false comfort, now felt like a pit of serpents twisting in the shadows. BIMBO's hands trembled violently as he clutched the empty tray against his chest. His breathing quickened. His pupils shrank. It was the look of a trapped man, a man whose lies were unraveling faster than he could conceal them. Lumo held his gaze without blinking, without mercy, without judgment, just truth. Pure, heavy, blinding truth. And in that suffocating silence, the king, who had built his entire kingdom on trust, felt something inside him shatter. He had let poison come within inches of his life. He had allowed betrayal to wear the uniform of loyalty. And worst of all, he had never noticed until a stranger walked in from the night and showed him what had been hiding in plain sight. BIMBO opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to deny, perhaps to beg, perhaps to lie one last time. But the king rose from his chair with a slow, deliberate certainty none had ever seen from him before. The truth had woken, and it was not going to sleep again. The metallic bitterness still burned on the king's tongue when the world seemed to tilt for a heartbeat, and in that fleeting moment the hall felt heavier, as though the very air had drawn a sharp breath. The torches flickered violently, shadows skittering across the stone walls like startled birds, and Lumo, silent, unmoving, observant, lifted his gaze toward the king with an expression that felt less like concern and more like acknowledgement. Something inside the king snapped awake. A memory? A suspicion? A distant whisper he had ignored for too long? He set the cup down slowly, realizing only now how violently his hands were shaking. "Your Majesty? Is everything well?" BIMBO's voice floated from behind him, too soft, too measured, too carefully shaped. For the first time in years, the king heard the undertone beneath the loyalty, the thin tremor of a man who feared being seen. Lumo stepped closer, not touching, merely standing within arm's reach, and the king felt a surge of energy, strange, electric, ancient, rising from the floor, filling the space around them. The hall dissolved into a haze as a single image burst into the king's vision. BIMBO crouched in the storage room, mixing something dark and oily into a jar of dried herbal leaves. It lasted less than a second, but it hit him like a hammer. He gasped and stumbled back, his heartbeat crashing through his chest like a war drum. Lumo didn't move. His eyes burned with quiet certainty, the certainty of someone who had been waiting for the king to finally see what stood naked before him. And as the vision faded, the king slowly turned toward Bakeri with a horror he could no longer swallow. Bakeri's face cracked. Just a flicker, just the corner of an eyelid twitching, but enough. The king saw fear ignite there, saw guilt trembling like an animal trapped behind his pupils, and the hall that once felt familiar now seemed poisoned by the man standing behind him. The king's voice broke the silence, low and sharper than he intended. "Guards." Only that single word. Yet it thundered through the hall like a decree carved into stone. Metal scraped, boots thudded, and Bakeri paled so violently it was as though blood had abandoned his body. "My king, wait, what is this?" he stammered, but his voice was no longer smooth. It was jagged, breathless. Lying. The king rarely doubted people, and that was his flaw. But tonight, with the bitter taste on his tongue and the vision still haunting him, doubt flooded him like a rising tide. The guards advanced, but Bakeri stepped back, trembling. "Your Majesty, I swear on my life," he choked, glancing desperately between the king and Lumo, as if one of them might give him mercy. But all Lumo gave him was silence. Silence sharp enough to peel truth from bone. Bakeri broke then. His confidence collapsed, replaced by something frantic and unhinged. He spun toward the door, but the guards blocked him. He tried to speak, but the words tangled. And finally, with shaking hands raised in surrender, he whispered, "It was not my choice." The king felt cold spread through his chest. "Seize him," he ordered, and the guards pinned Bakeri to the floor, snapping metal cuffs around his wrists. Bakeri screamed, not in pain, but in betrayal, as though he believed the king owed him protection. The king watched, heart cracking, grief and fury twisting inside him like twin serpents. They dragged Bakeri into the palace's lower chamber, a room built for interrogation but rarely used, a place of stone walls and echoing footsteps. The air smelled of damp earth and old torches, and the king followed with Lumo gliding silently behind him. Bakeri collapsed onto the stone floor, the cuffs clinking as he shook. "Please," he begged, breath fractured. "I served you since I was a boy. Since my father died. You took me in. I would never." His words tore into the king like claws, because memories rose unbidden. A young Bakeri running through the palace courtyard, Bakeri bringing him meals as a teenager, Bakeri standing beside him on nights of grief, offering tea and quiet reassurance. To think that the same hands once offered comfort now carried poison, it hollowed the king from the inside. "Why?" the king finally demanded, his voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. "Why would you do this?" Bakeri's face twisted, a mixture of shame and fury, as if the truth itself burned him. "Because loyalty has a price, and someone else finally paid it." The king's chest tightened. Lumo took a step forward, and the torches dimmed as if the room bowed to him. "He is not finished," Lumo murmured, voice flat, echoing with something ancient. "Let truth come to the surface." A pulse of energy rippled through the room, the same force that had shown the king the vision, and Bakeri's body jolted as if struck by invisible hands. The truth spilled from Bakeri in a torrent, as though his tongue no longer obeyed him, but instead obeyed the force that controlled the room. "They came to me months ago," he said, shaking violently. "The ministers who wore false smiles, the ones who hated how you listened to the people instead of them." His voice cracked as he continued, unable to stop. "They threatened me. They told me if I did not act, I would die. They said you would replace me soon. That you no longer trusted me." The king's heart twisted, because this part was half true. He had grown distant from Bakeri, not out of mistrust, but because the palace politics had consumed him. And Bakeri, feeling invisible, became easy prey. "I didn't want to do it," Bakeri whispered, tears streaking down his face. "But I thought, if I did this one thing, I would finally be valued." The king felt the floor tilt under him. Betrayal, manipulation, fear, all swirling into a darkness deeper than he expected. Before the king could respond, Bakeri's gaze jerked toward the ceiling. "There is more," he gasped, struggling as if truth itself strangled him. "There was a meeting, the storage cellar, 3 ministers, and someone higher, someone who promised to take your throne before the year ends." His breath hitched, his voice fractured into a sob. They said poison was the cleanest way. The king swallowed hard, the enormity of the conspiracy slamming into him like a tidal wave. Lumo stood still, watching truth unravel the fragile threads of the palace. "You see now," Lumo murmured. "Bakery was only the hand." The king exhaled shakily, anger finally burning through the grief. "Then we find the mind," he said, the words heavy with a new resolve he hadn't felt in years. Lumo nodded once, slow, deliberate, final. The torches flickered, the shadows shrank back into place, and the strange weight in the air lifted, as though truth had completed its work for the moment. Guards dragged Bakery to the holding cell, and the king watched him go, a part of him mourning the boy he once knew. But there was no room for softness now. The palace was rotting from within, and tonight had only peeled back the first layer. The king turned toward Lumo, who watched him with an unreadable expression, something between respect and warning. "Where do we begin?" the king asked. Lumo stepped closer, his voice low and resonant, each word settling like a stone in the king's chest. "We begin," he said, "by pulling the darkness into the light." And as they stepped out of the chamber, the air above them trembled, as if the palace itself sensed that the hunt for the real mastermind had finally begun. The courtyard was silent as dawn began to creep over the walls, yet inside the council hall, tension thickened the air like a storm about to break. Lumo remained still, almost invisible in the shadows, while the king, with Bakery safely locked away, summoned every minister and high-ranking official to the grand chamber. The hall, usually a place of decorum and politeness, now felt like a stage for revelation, the torches flickering as if echoing the unrest in the room. As the ministers entered, some tried to mask their anxiety with practiced bows and polite smiles, but Lumo's presence seemed to strip every pretense away. The king's gaze swept across the room, eyes lingering on those who had whispered behind closed doors and stolen opportunities while the palace slept, and a silent electricity pulsed through the room, the kind that makes even the boldest hearts tremble. Whispers began to rise, but Lumo's quiet authority seemed to hold the air in place, making every lie feel exposed even before a word was spoken. One by one, Lumo's gaze passed over the ministers, and as it did, the room changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Shadows bent unnaturally, revealing truths in the flickering light that only the king could perceive. A minister who had stolen gold from the treasury looked suddenly pallid as the evidence of his crime shimmered before the king's eyes, etched in light and memory. Another who had secretly supported rival factions froze, caught in the act of unspoken betrayal, his ambition laid bare for all to feel without a single accusation. The king could see the threads of deception stretching between them, tangled and fragile, and the sense of betrayal cut sharper than any sword. Panic whispered at the edges of the room as Lumo's presence turned whispers into confession, a silent unveiling of each hidden intent. The hall felt alive, almost sentient, responding to the waves of truth that Lumo commanded, and for the first time, the king realized the depth of the rot that had silently spread in his palace. Chaos followed swiftly as the truth became undeniable. Ministers attempted to protest, deny, or flee, but Lumo's subtle power made every attempt futile. Their own memories and intentions betrayed them. The king stood firm, now fully understanding the weight of Lumo's gift, while the guards moved decisively, securing those whose deception was proven beyond doubt. One by one, each conspirator faced the consequences of their ambitions. The air was thick with fear, regret, and a bitter clarity that left no room for further concealment. It was not just punishment that unfolded, but an unmasking of character. Every false smile and carefully crafted lie burned away in the harsh light of undeniable truth. Even the most confident ministers quivered, forced to reckon with a reality they had tried to manipulate and hide, and the king felt a grim satisfaction that justice, long delayed, had finally found its course. At the heart of the chamber, the true mastermind behind the palace's most dangerous schemes was revealed. An influential minister, one whose envy of the king's popularity had driven him to orchestrate poisonings and secret betrayals, fell to his knees when the weight of Lumo's revelation became inescapable. His every hidden action, every secret meeting, and every malicious thought was laid bare, and he could no longer cling to appearances. The king watched, a mixture of anger and awe in his eyes, as the palace's hidden dangers were neutralized one by one, the conspirators brought to heel by the unyielding power of truth. Lumo remained silent, an enigmatic presence who had guided the king through darkness, now preparing to leave as silently as he had arrived. The palace, once a place of whispered lies and hidden threats, now breathed with renewed clarity. In that moment, the king understood that while he had survived the night, it was Lumo's unseen hand that had ensured the palace would endure the dawn. The morning light spilled gently over Bantukwu, brushing the palace walls with soft gold and chasing away the shadows of the long, harrowing night. The hallways, which had witnessed whispers of betrayal and the sudden unraveling of carefully guarded secrets, now echoed only with the quiet shuffle of servants tidying, replacing torches, and resetting the grand tables. The king walked slowly through these familiar corridors, each step heavy with the weight of what he had seen and learned. For the first time in years, he understood the precarious nature of trust, and the burden of leadership pressed down on him with newfound clarity. The palace, though safe from immediate danger, bore the invisible scars of deception, each corner a silent witness to the truths that had been revealed. Lumo, whose presence had guided the king through this night of revelations, was nowhere to be seen, and yet the silence he left behind resonated with an almost tangible power. The king's footsteps carried him to the courtyard, where the cool morning breeze swept through the empty spaces, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine and dew-damp earth. He paused, closing his eyes as he recalled every face in the council hall. The ministers whose loyalty had been nothing more than a mask, the servants who had watched in silent fear, and Bakari, whose betrayal had struck deepest because of the bond he had shared with the king. Memories of Lumo's quiet yet piercing gaze returned vividly. The way he had moved through the shadows, touching walls, observing without speaking, yet revealing so much, lingered in the king's mind. He understood that Lumo's gift had not been in punishing the guilty, but in illuminating the truth, forcing the kingdom to confront its own failings. For the first time, the king felt the enormity of what had transpired, not just as a night of crisis, but as a night of awakening for both him and the palace he ruled. The council hall had emptied, yet the lessons of the night were etched permanently in the king's mind. He convened his remaining loyal ministers and advisors, determined to rebuild a palace founded not merely on appearances, but on vigilance, honesty, and genuine loyalty. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, shaping a vision for a new administration that would guard against the subtle seductions of ambition and treachery. He instructed careful audits of the treasury, the protection of sacred texts, and the constant presence of eyes and ears he could trust implicitly. Above all, he vowed to never allow the blind devotion of a single servant or the smooth words of ministers to cloud his judgment again. The palace, he realized, would only thrive if he nurtured discernment alongside compassion, and if he remembered the lesson that loyalty, when taken for granted, could become a dangerous illusion. Outside, the city of Bantukwu stirred to life, unaware of the transformation that had taken place behind the palace walls. Merchants began their morning calls, children ran barefoot across the sunlit streets, and the scent of baked bread and roasting meats drifted through narrow alleys. Yet, the legend of the night lingered invisibly, like an echo only those who had witnessed it could hear. The king lingered in the courtyard, imagining how future generations might speak of a single, mysterious figure who had walked in quietly, revealed the darkness, and left without reward or recognition. In his heart, he carried the memory of Lumo's words. "I do not stay where truth is revealed, I only go where truth is still asleep." Those words, simple yet profound, became a guiding principle for the king, a reminder that vigilance, wisdom, and courage must always accompany compassion. By the time the sun had climbed fully above the city, Lumo had vanished as completely as he had appeared. No footprint marked his passing, no servant recalled his last step, and yet his influence was etched deeply into the bones of the palace. The king walked through the halls one final time, pausing to touch familiar pillars, to look out over the quiet gardens, and to breathe in the stillness that followed the storm. He knew that the night of revelations would forever remain a turning point, not just in the palace's history, but in his life as a ruler. Lumo had shown him that the survival of a kingdom depended not on fear or force, but on the courage to face truth, however painful it might be. And as the king finally stepped into the sunlit courtyard, he felt a rare serenity. The palace was whole, the conspirators had been brought to justice, and the kingdom was, for the first time in many years, truly awake. Bantukwu had survived, and its people would grow stronger.